Today's Wednesday, May 29th, 2019, Wednesday of the 6th week of Easter, and also the feast of Pope St. Paul VI. Quite probably one of the popes of last century that had it the worst. Between John Paul II and Paul VI, both of them had to live through some horrific and terrible times. It certainly was a very tumultuous time, both in society and in the church. Pope Paul VI was elected in the 60s. The Vatican Council was coming to a conclusion. The world had already gone through a couple of world wars. You'd had Korea, you've got Vietnam on the horizon. And then he's brought in, and the question left remaining from the Second Vatican Council on the morality of contraception was on his desk.
Pope Paul really did come onto the scene at a time when his leadership was necessary, given all of the things that were going on in Europe and socially, around the world at that time.
I think many people do realize that at the Second Vatican Council, when they were producing the document Gaudium et Spes, they wanted to talk about contraception then, and it was shelved because it needed further discussion. And I do believe it is safe to say that Pope St. Paul VI may be one of the most misunderstood people from the 20th century. So at the request of Pope John the 23rd, when the Vatican Council did conclude, they did put aside the question of artificial contraception and put together a commission that began to study it. The work of the commission was supposed to be behind closed doors. The public really should not have had access to any of the information. But apparently at that time, some of the reports were that there was a majority on the commission in favor of approving artificial contraception. Of course, in historical context, that would have been the logical conclusion. That would have been what everybody wanted. But thanks be to God, wishful thinking and personal desires are not necessarily in the plan of God. The commission did wrap up and did submit all of its findings, if you will, to Pope Paul VI. Now, of course, we all know that in the 1960s, that really rabid sexual revolution was underway. I say really rabid because there was a sexual revolution prior to that one back in the 1920s after the First World War.
Through the Holy Spirit has raised up these men as popes to be leaders at the church to respond to a certain time and a certain need.
I was actually surprised myself to find out that there are many who do recognize that after the First World War, there was a sexual revolution going on. It was an era of burlesque and flappers. There was also this thing that had happened during World War I, where the army had to send a lot of their soldiers into battle, and they didn't have enough time to train them so that they could be a little more chaste. And so they came up with a thing called prophylaxis. As the expression goes, when a sailor is in port, a lot of sailors were coming into port, a lot of these military guys were coming into port, and they weren't being the most moral gentlemen around. So many of them would go and visit these houses of ill repute. Now, in that period of history, there was very little knowledge about sexually transmitted disease and other things, but they did know this. There was a treatment that these guys could undergo if they went out and spent time with prostitutes. From a military perspective, the last thing you needed was to have your military compromised by those who were impacted or brought down by venereal disease. And so the military developed this little kit, if you will, this little way of kind of cleaning everything when you got home. Pretty much like the same mentality that you now get today, it's all about preventing the spread of disease. But the impact that comes out of it is, you mean I can do this kind of activity without any punishment or problems? Think for a second now in a young man's mind what he would start to believe at that point. As the title of one of the books suggests, he figured he had a magic bullet. Let's admit it, sex is not something new. It's been around since the beginning of time. And have there been the same desires and the same passions in the heart of man since? There have. Now, taking out the question of sin, morality, and things of that nature, what was one of the things that basically helped people to keep their lust in check? the problems that come when you're not doing it the way God wanted it. But now a lot of the verbiage has to change, because now it's not just a matter of pregnancy, it's an unwanted pregnancy. It's now not a matter of disease, it's one of those preventable diseases. If you can prevent the disease, what's to stop you from taking the risky behavior? Putting a gun like that in the hands of a bunch of young men who are far away from home, what ended up starting to happen? They started to do it more often. And of course, the military, they came up with their solution. We can't have these guys knocked out for any period of time. Therefore, get them back up, get them running. Of course, now you begin to fast forward the whole question, and you start getting into the 60s. By then, the pill had arrived. By then, there was a lot more in terms of contraception. In the 1930s, other Christian denominations broke from tradition and started to permit contraception. And so by the time Pope Paul VI comes on the scene, there's already a huge sexual revolution, much bigger than the one in the 20s. And so Pope Paul VI was elected when there was a perfect storm in the world, swirling and expecting and wanting to be able to indulge their lusts.
So, Pope Paul VI, or I guess Pope St. Paul VI now, he, like many other popes, for me, is a way of showing how the Holy Spirit really is at work in the church.
Let me ask you, Father, when you were in the seminary, did you learn much about Humanae Vitae?
Humanae Vitae we have studied.
Father Peter, can you just say something about the Humanae Vitae?
Of course I can say something about Humanae Vitae. That's what I've been doing all morning on this vlog. Now we have to remember that Paul VI, being caught in this perfect storm, still had to remind himself that he is the successor to St. Peter and the vicar of Christ on earth. I mean, I couldn't imagine out of the billions of people on earth being the one who was elected to be the successor to St. Peter, the one who is the vicar of Christ. That's got to be pretty intimidating for somebody, I would hope. And so Paul VI, when he came into office, also was bound by truth. See, that's the part we forget sometimes. People had these very visceral reactions to Humanae Vitae. They wanted what they wanted, but they forget that what he's speaking about is truth. And so he taps into what we call natural law, not the law of nature, which would be the biological part of it. He taps into the natural law. And in the natural law, moral things are understood in their ends, and anything that frustrates them from reaching that end is immoral. And of course, the end of the sexual faculty, the sexual act, is procreation. And so Paul VI did not just wake up and decide that he wanted to frustrate the world and frustrate people who just wanted to indulge their lusts. He woke up and said, but I am still bound by truth.
But, in recent history, it just seems that the church has had a need. The world has had a need. And the Holy Spirit has responded to that need.
So it's almost time to begin Holy Mass here. I know that today is the feast of Paul VI, but our little ordo does not list it as an option. Maybe they'll do that in the future, I don't know. But anyhow, I'm going to offer Mass today, and I will keep you in my prayers.
Thank you
Today,
very much.
I'm giving the practice, not the he knows everything.